The courtroom was filled with a strange kind of silence, the kind that doesn't come from respect but from judgment, where people aren't just listening but quietly deciding who they think is right. A pregnant woman stood near the defense table, one hand resting on her stomach and the other holding a few papers, her face showing exhaustion and quiet anxiety. For everyone else in the room, this was just another case, but for her, it was the most important moment of her life. Across from her stood her husband, calm and confident, as if he already knew how this would end. Standing close beside him was another woman, dressed neatly, posture straight, and wearing a smile that made it clear she felt comfortable, almost proud, being there. The woman glanced at the pregnant wife and let out a small laugh, then leaned toward the man and whispered something to him. That laugh wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be, because the message was clear. She believed she had already won. The pregnant woman lowered her eyes, but then the other woman spoke, her tone mocking as she commented that stress wasn't good for the baby. A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom as a few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The pregnant woman flinched slightly and pressed her hand more firmly against her stomach, but she didn't respond. To many people watching, her silence looked like weakness, as if she had nothing to say and no way to defend herself. The judge sat at the bench reviewing documents, his expression calm but attentive. He had handled countless cases involving divorce, betrayal, and broken families. Yet something about this one felt heavier, as if more was at stake than what was written on paper. When the clerk read the case details, the husband's lawyer began speaking confidently, presenting a version of events where the husband was reasonable, the wife was emotionally unstable, and the pregnancy was simply unfortunate timing. The woman beside the husband stood comfortably, her body language relaxed, as if the courtroom were a stage and she was watching a performance. She already knew the ending too. The pregnant wife remained silent, without a lawyer, without drama, without tears, taking steady breaths while a small heartbeat continued inside her. Then the judge finally looked up first at the pregnant woman, and then slowly at the other woman. He paused for a moment, long enough for the room to grow even quieter, before commenting that the woman seemed very comfortable speaking today. The woman smiled and replied that she was only telling the truth, adding that some people refuse to accept reality. She then glanced at the pregnant wife and suggested that pregnancy was often used to gain sympathy. The courtroom went completely silent. Even the husband shifted slightly, sensing the tension change, but the pregnant woman still didn't speak. The judge leaned back and folded his hands before saying he had one. Question. He looked directly at the woman standing beside the husband and asked how long she had been involved with a married man while his wife was pregnant. For a brief moment, the woman's smile disappeared. The husband's expression tightened, and everyone in the room could feel the atmosphere shift. That single question did what no argument had done so far. It changed everything. The question hung in the air longer than anyone expected. No one spoke. The woman standing beside the husband didn't answer right away. Her confident posture shifted just slightly, enough for those watching closely to notice. The smile she had been wearing so easily only moments ago had faded, replaced by hesitation. The husband glanced at her, then quickly looked away. The judge waited. He didn't repeat the question. He didn't raise his voice. He simply waited. Finally, the woman cleared her throat and gave a short laugh, trying to recover. She said the timeline didn't matter, and that the court should focus on the divorce itself, not personal details meant to distract. The judge nodded slowly, as if considering her response. Then he leaned forward. Timelines matter, he said calmly, when they explain behavior. The room felt tighter. The judge turned his attention briefly to the pregnant woman, who remained still, her expression controlled, her hand still resting protectively over her stomach. She hadn't spoken once, but her presence was impossible to ignore. The judge then looked back at the husband. You've described your wife as emotionally unstable, he said, and you've suggested this pregnancy complicated matters. The husband nodded, confident again, sensing an opening. Yes, Your Honor, he said. That's exactly the issue. The judge raised an eyebrow. Then help the court understand, he continued. When did this relationship begin? The husband hesitated. The woman beside him shifted uncomfortably. The judge waited again. "It started after we separated," the husband said finally. The judge didn't react immediately. Instead, he reached for a document from the file in front of him and adjusted his glasses. "This text message," he said, reading from the page, "is dated 4 months before the separation." The courtroom stirred. The husband stiffened. The woman beside him crossed her arms. The judge continued reading, then another message, then another. Each one pushed the timeline further back. The confidence in the room began to drain. The woman's jaw tightened as she realized the judge wasn't asking casually. He was building something. The judge set the papers down. "So I'll ask again," he said, calmly, evenly. "How long were you involved with a married man whose wife was pregnant?" The silence this time felt heavier. The pregnant woman finally lifted her eyes, not to speak but simply to watch. The woman beside the husband swallowed. The husband's lawyer stood quickly, attempting to interrupt, suggesting the question was unfair and irrelevant to custody or separation terms. The judge raised a hand. "It's relevant," he said firmly, "because credibility matters." The lawyer sat back down. The judge looked back at the woman. "This court isn't interested in humiliation," he said. "It's interested in honesty." The woman's voice, when she finally spoke, was quieter than before. "It was complicated," she said. The judge nodded. "Complicated," he repeated, "but not unclear." He leaned back slightly. "What this court sees," he continued, "is a woman being mocked for her silence, while others speak freely on her behalf." The pregnant woman shifted slightly, adjusting her stance, but still said nothing. The judge glanced at her again. "Silence," he said, "does not mean consent." The word settled into the room. The husband's confident posture collapsed just a little. The woman beside him looked down for the first time. The judge closed the file. "This hearing will continue," he said, "with a full review of conduct, timing, and credibility." He paused. "And this court will not ignore the impact of public humiliation on someone already carrying more than enough." The pregnant woman exhaled quietly. The courtroom no longer felt certain. What had seemed like a simple case was no longer simple at all, and the question that started it all had opened a door no one could close. The courtroom felt different now, not louder, not calmer, heavier. The judge's words had shifted something. No one could ignore, and the confidence that once filled the room had quietly begun to drain away. The woman, who had been standing so comfortably beside the husband, now kept her arms crossed tightly, her gaze fixed on the floor. The judge turned another page in the file. "These proceedings," he said, "will address conduct, credibility, and the effect of that conduct on all parties involved." His eyes briefly rested on the pregnant woman. She stood exactly where she had been before, her posture steady, her expression controlled, her hand still resting protectively over her stomach. She hadn't spoken a single word, but the courtroom seemed to revolve around her now. The husband's lawyer stood and attempted to regain control, speaking carefully about separation dates, legal definitions, and emotional misunderstandings, framing the situation as complicated but ultimately harmless. The judge listened without interruption. Then he looked up. "Harmless," he repeated calmly, "is not the word this court would use." He gestured slightly toward the pregnant woman. "Public mockery," he continued, "particularly towards someone in a physically vulnerable condition, carries weight." The room stayed silent. The woman beside the husband shifted again, clearly uncomfortable. The ease she had shown earlier was gone, replaced by something closer to regret or fear. The judge addressed her directly. "You chose to speak today," he said evenly. "You chose to make comments." She looked up, startled. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied quietly. "Then you also accept responsibility for what those comments reveal," the judge said. The husband leaned forward, attempting to intervene, but stopped when the judge raised his hand. "This court is not interested in sides," the judge continued. "It is interested in truth." He turned back to the file. "These messages," he said, "suggest continued contact during a period you described as separation." The husband's jaw tightened. The judge continued calmly. "Which brings us back to intent." The pregnant woman shifted her weight slightly. Her breathing remained steady, but the tension in the room made even small movements noticeable. The judge glanced at her again. "Mrs. he said gently. "You have been silent throughout these proceedings." She nodded. "Would you like to speak now?" he asked. For a brief moment it seemed like she might, but then she shook her head. "No," she said softly. The courtroom reacted, not with sound but with attention. The judge nodded. "That is your right," he said. He turned back to the others. "And it is not a weakness." The woman beside the husband swallowed. The judge continued. "This court recognizes that silence can be restraint, not surrender." The husband leaned back, his earlier confidence now visibly shaken. The judge closed the file once more. "This hearing will proceed with a full evaluation of behavior before and after separation," he said, "including impact of public conduct on a pregnant spouse." He paused. "And the court will not ignore what has already been shown here today." The room felt suspended. The woman who had laughed earlier now looked unsure of where to place her hands. The husband stared straight ahead, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The pregnant woman remained still. For the first time, the balance of the room had shifted, not because she spoke, but because she didn't have to. The judge called for a short recess, but the courtroom did not relax. People remained seated, whispering quietly, stealing glances at the three figures at the center of the case. What had started as a simple divorce hearing had slowly turned into something far more uncomfortable, an examination of behavior, timing, and intent. When the judge returned, the room fell silent instantly. He sat down, adjusted the papers in front of him, and looked up with a seriousness that made it clear this phase of the hearing would be different. "This court has reviewed the material presented so far," he said evenly. "And before we move forward, I want to clarify something." His gaze moved across the room, then settled on the husband. "Confidence," the judge said, "does not equal credibility." The husband shifted in his chair. The judge continued. "You presented your wife as emotionally unstable," he said, "and her silence as evidence of that instability." He paused, then looked briefly at the pregnant woman. However, he added, "Silence in this court does not automatically mean inability." The room felt heavier. The judge turned toward the woman standing beside the husband. "You," he said calmly, "chose to speak freely today." She nodded, uncertain. "You chose to comment on a pregnant woman's condition in open court," he continued, "and you chose to frame that commentary as honesty." She swallowed. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Honesty," he said, "has consequences." The woman looked toward the husband, then back at the judge, realizing she was no longer shielded by confidence or proximity. The judge reached for another document. "This court has also reviewed medical timelines," he said, "and financial records." The husband's lawyer stood immediately. "Your Honor," he began, "we object." The judge raised a hand. "You'll have time," he said calmly. "Sit." The lawyer sat. The judge continued. "These records suggest that during the period when the wife was pregnant, there was a withdrawal of financial support," he said. "Not gradual, not mutual." The husband clenched his jaw. "That decision," the judge said, "coincides with the beginning of another relationship." The woman beside him stiffened. The judge looked directly at her. "You understood the circumstances," he said. "You knew she was pregnant." She hesitated. "Yes," she said quietly. The room reacted, not with noise, but with attention. "And yet," the judge continued, "you felt comfortable mocking her." The woman oaked down. The judge turned toward the pregnant woman again. She remained standing, composed, her expression steady, her hands still resting protectively over her stomach. "You have not defended yourself verbally," the judge said gently. She nodded. "Do you understand what is being discussed?" he asked. "Yes," she replied softly. "Do you feel misrepresented?" he asked. She paused. "Yes," she said. One word. But it landed. The judge nodded slowly. "That answer," he said, "carries weight." The husband leaned forward, clearly frustrated. "Your Honor," he said, "this is turning into a character evaluation rather than a legal matter." The judge met his eyes. "Character becomes relevant," he replied, "when behavior affects outcomes." He leaned back slightly. "This court is tasked with determining fairness," he continued, "and fairness cannot exist without context. The judge flipped another page. There are also records, he said, of conversations where pregnancy was described as a complication. The husband looked away. The woman beside him shifted uncomfortably. Complication, the judge repeated. Not responsibility, not concern. The pregnant woman's posture remained unchanged, but something in the room shifted toward her. The judge addressed the courtroom. What we are seeing, he said, is not a woman using pregnancy for sympathy. He paused. What we are seeing is a woman enduring judgment in silence. The room remained still. The judge turned. Back to the husband. You believed her silence meant weakness, he said. He then looked briefly at the woman beside him. And you mistook restraint for permission. Neither responded. The judge closed the file. This court will proceed with a full evaluation of conduct, including emotional impact and timing, he said. Because actions taken during vulnerability matter. He paused. And mockery, he added, reveals more about the speaker than the subject. The woman beside the husband looked visibly shaken now. The husband stared straight ahead, no longer confident, no longer relaxed. The pregnant woman remained where she was, calm, steady, unbroken. The judge concluded. This hearing will continue with further examination, he said, and assumptions made earlier will not be carried forward. The gavel struck lightly. As people began to shift in their seats, it was clear that the balance of the courtroom had changed again. The case was no longer about who spoke the loudest. It was about who stood when it mattered, and the silence that once looked like weakness was now being understood for what it truly was: strength. By the time the hearing resumed, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had shifted again. It was no longer hostile, and it was no longer confident. It was careful. People sat straighter in their seats, aware now that every word mattered. The quiet conversations from earlier were gone, replaced by an uneasy stillness. What had once felt like a predictable case was slowly turning into something no one had anticipated. The judge returned to the bench and took a moment before speaking, allowing the silence to settle. He looked at the file in front of him, then raised his eyes toward the husband. This court has reviewed more than just statements, he said evenly. It has reviewed patterns. The husband adjusted his posture, trying to appear composed, but the ease he once carried was gone. Patterns, the judge continued, do not appear overnight, they develop. He turned slightly, addressing the room as a whole. In this case, he said, the pattern involves timing, behavior, and how power was exercised during vulnerability. The pregnant woman remained standing where she had been throughout the hearing. Her posture was steady, her expression controlled, her presence calm. She had become the quiet center of the room, even without speaking. The judge shifted his attention to the woman who had earlier mocked her. You were confident when you arrived, he said calmly. Confident enough to comment openly. The woman nodded slowly, her earlier boldness gone. You believed the situation was settled, the judge continued. That belief shaped how you behaved. She didn't respond. The judge leaned forward slightly. Mockery, he said, is rarely accidental. It often reflects perceived safety. The words landed. The woman glanced toward the husband, then quickly looked away. The judge turned to the husband. You described your wife as emotionally unstable, he said. You described the pregnancy as complicating matters. The husband nodded stiffly. And yet, the judge continued, you failed to explain why support changed during that same period. The husband opened his mouth to speak, then hesitated. The judge waited. It was a stressful time, the husband finally said. We were already separating. The judge raised an eyebrow. Stress, he replied calmly, does not excuse withdrawal of responsibility. The courtroom remained silent. The judge picked up another document. These financial records, he said, show a clear reduction in support during the pregnancy. The husband's lawyer stood quickly. Your Honor, you may sit, the judge said without looking up. The lawyer sat. The judge continued. This court must consider not only legality, he said, but impact. He looked briefly at the pregnant woman. Pregnancy, he said, is not a strategic advantage. The woman's shoulders remained relaxed, but her grip on the papers tightened slightly. It is a condition that requires care, the judge continued, and when that care is withdrawn, it matters. The judge then turned toward the woman beside the husband. You were aware of the pregnancy, he said. Yes, she replied quietly. And you were aware of the circumstances, he added. She nodded. And yet, he continued, you chose ridicule. The woman looked down, unable to meet his gaze. The judge leaned bar. Sir Kay, this court does not exist to shame, he said. But it does exist to understand. He paused. What we see here, he continued, is a situation where silence was interpreted as permission. The pregnant woman shifted her weight slightly, her breathing steady. Silence, the judge said, can also be restraint. The husband leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped tightly together. The judge addressed him again. You believed this hearing would be straightforward, he said. You believed your narrative would stand unchallenged. The husband said nothing. But credibility, the judge continued, is not determined by confidence. He closed the file slowly. This court will now move toward a full evaluation of custody considerations, financial responsibility, and conduct during pregnancy. The room reacted quietly. The woman beside the husband looked visibly shaken now. The assurance she had brought into the courtroom was gone, replaced by uncertainty. The pregnant woman remained still, not because she was afraid, but because she didn't need to move. The judge concluded this portion of the hearing. The court will reconvene, he said, to finalize its findings. The gavel struck lightly. As people stood, it was clear that something fundamental had changed. The case was no longer framed by who spoke the loudest or laughed the hardest. It was being shaped by what could no longer be denied. And the woman who had once been mocked in silence now stood at the center of a process that was finally listening. When the courtroom reconvened, the energy was unmistakably different. No one whispered now. No one smiled. The earlier confidence that had once belonged to the husband and the woman beside him had been replaced by caution. Every movement felt measured. Every breath felt deliberate. The judge took his seat and looked around the room before speaking. This court has spent considerable time reviewing not only facts, he said, but behavior. He paused, letting the words settle. Behavior, he continued, often reveals what words attempt to hide. The husband sat upright, his hands clasped together tightly. The calm certainty he had displayed at the start of the hearing was gone. He avoided looking at the pregnant woman, focusing instead on the edge of the table in front of him. The woman who had once mocked her now stood with her shoulders tense and her gaze lowered. She no longer looked like someone watching a performance. She looked like someone realizing she had stepped into the wrong story. The judge turned his attention back to the file. This court has reviewed communication records, financial changes, and testimony, he said. What emerges is not confusion, but sequence. He looked directly at the husband. Sequence matters, he said, because it tells us who acted and when the husband's lawyer shifted but did not stand. The judge continued. Support was reduced during pregnancy, he said. Contact with an other party increased during that same period. He paused. That overlap is not incidental. The room stayed silent. The judge turned to the woman beside the husband. You described yourself as honest, he said calmly. Honesty requires consistency. She nodded slightly, though her face showed strain. You mocked someone who had chosen not to speak, the judge continued. You assumed that silence meant safety. He paused. But silence, he said, can also mean restraint. The pregnant woman remained still, her posture unchanged, her expression composed. She had not spoken again since her single word earlier, yet the proceedings continued to revolve around her presence. The judge addressed her again. You have remained silent throughout most of this hearing, he said gently. Not because you were instructed to, but because you chose to. She nodded. That choice, he continued, does not diminish your position. The husband finally looked up. Your Honor, he said, attempting to steady his voice. I never intended harm. The judge met his gaze. Intent, he replied calmly, does not erase impact. The husband leaned back slightly, as if the weight of the words had physically pushed him. The judge flipped another page. This court has also considered witness statements, he said, including observations of behavior outside this courtroom. The woman beside the husband stiffened, behavior that reflects confidence built on assumption, the judge continued. Assumption that consequences would not follow. He looked directly at her. That assumption was incorrect. She lowered her eyes. The judge then addressed the courtroom. What we see here, he said, is not a single moment of poor judgment. He paused. It is a series of choices made during a period of vulnerability. The pregnant woman adjusted her stance slightly, steadying herself. This court does not ignore vulnerability, the judge continued, especially when it is met with ridicule. The room felt heavy again, but this time the weight felt deliberate, purposeful. The judge leaned back. The final phase of this hearing, he said, will consider responsibility. The husband's lawyer finally stood. Your Honor, he said carefully, we request leniency in interpretation. Emotions were high. The judge looked at him calmly. Emotions are often high, he said. That does not excuse conduct. The lawyer sat. The judge turned back to the husband. You believe this case would be decided by who spoke first and loudest, he said. He paused. You were mistaken. The pregnant woman's expression did not change, but the shift in power was undeniable now. The judge closed the file. This court will proceed toward final determination, he said, taking into account conduct, timing, and credibility. He looked briefly at the woman beside the husband. Mockery, he said, is not strength. He then looked at the pregnant woman. And restraint, he added, is not weakness. The words settled over the courtroom like a verdict already forming. The judge concluded, this hearing will move forward to final ruling. The gavel struck once. No one moved. The woman who had once laughed stood silently, her confidence gone. The husband remained seated, his earlier certainty replaced by something closer to realization. And the pregnant woman stood calmly, steady and composed, not because she had won, but because she had endured. The outcome was no longer a mystery. It was simply waiting to be spoken. The courtroom was silent when everyone returned for the final time. Not the uneasy silence from before, and not the tense kind either. This silence felt settled, as if the room itself understood that nothing more needed to be proven. The judge took his seat and looked out across the courtroom, his expression calm but firm. He didn't rush. He didn't shuffle papers. He simply allowed the moment to exist before speaking. This court has reviewed all testimony, documentation, and conduct presented, he said evenly. Not only what was said, but how it was said and when. The husband sat motionless, his earlier confidence completely gone. He no longer looked toward the woman who stood beside him. Whatever assurance he once drew from her presence had disappeared. She stood quietly now, her posture stiff, her eyes fixed straight ahead. The ease and certainty she had arrived with were nowhere to be seen. The pregnant woman remained stand, near the defense table, her posture steady, her face composed. She hadn't spoken much throughout the hearing, but by now her silence carried more weight than words ever could. The judge continued. This case was initially presented as a simple separation, he said, but it revealed something more complex. He paused. It revealed how assumptions are made about silence, vulnerability, and strength. His eyes moved briefly to the pregnant woman. This court does not view pregnancy as weakness, he said, nor does it view restraint as surrender. The room remained completely still. The judge then turned his attention to the woman who had mocked her earlier. You chose ridicule, he said calmly. You chose confidence built on the belief that consequences would not follow. He paused. They did. The woman swallowed, her jaw tightening, but she said nothing. The judge turned back to the husband. You described your wife as emotionally unstable, he said. You described the pregnancy as a complication. He paused again. This court finds that description inaccurate. The husband shifted slightly in his chair but did not respond. What this court sees, the judge continued, is a pattern of withdrawal during a period of vulnerability, paired with conduct that minimized responsibility and amplified harm. The judge leaned forward slightly. Support was reduced, he said. Respect was lost, and silence was misinterpreted. The pregnant woman's hand rested gently on her stomach as she listened, her breathing calm, her expression unchanged. This court also recognizes, the judge said, that public humiliation has lasting impact. He looked around the room, especially when directed at someone carrying more than their share. The words settled deeply. The judge straightened. Therefore, he said, this court rules with consideration for fairness, accountability, and future stability. The husband's lawyer lowered his head. The judge continued outlining the ruling, addressing financial responsibility, custody considerations, and conduct expectations moving forward. His tone was steady, deliberate, and final. The court finds that the wife's silence throughout these proceedings was not evidence of weakness, he said. It was evidence of control. He paused. And control, he added, is strength. The courtroom remained, silent as the ruling concluded. The judge finished with one final statement. This case stands as a reminder, he said, that mockery reveals insecurity and dignity reveals resilience. He lifted the gavel. This court is adjourned. The sound echoed once, and that was it. For a moment, no one moved. Then chairs shifted, papers were gathered. Quiet conversations began. The woman who had once laughed stood frozen, her confidence replaced by realization. The husband remained seated for a few seconds longer, staring at the table in front of him, as if trying to understand when exactly the ground had shifted beneath him. The pregnant woman turned slowly and began to walk away. She did not smile. She did not look back. She didn't need to. Outside the courtroom, the noise of the world returned. But something had changed. What had once felt overwhelming now felt lighter, not because the journey was over, but because it was finally being carried with truth. She paused briefly in the hallway, resting her hand on her stomach. Whatever came next, she would face it with clarity, and the silence that once made her a target had become the very thing that carried her through. The story that began with mockery ended with understanding, and the question that changed everything had done exactly what it was meant to do. It ended it all,